showed that the empire was no longer master of its own fate. Foreign powers could use its weakness against it, and even its strongest acts of resistance could be twisted into excuses for conquest. The flames that consumed the opium at Human were not the end of the crisis, but the beginning of a new chapter of decline. The defeat in the First Opium War did not end with battles or burnt ships. Its true weight fell in the treaties that followed. For centuries, China had dictated the terms of foreign trade, confident in its size, wealth, and traditions. But with the Treaty of Nanking and those that followed, this confidence was shattered. The empire was forced to sign agreements that favoured the victors, agreements so one-sided that they came to be called unequal treaties. These documents, stamped with imperial seals, legalised what had once been forbidden, opened doors that had once been closed, and stripped away powers that had once been absolute. It is almost absurd that centuries of imperial pride could be undone not by a grand conquest, but by a stack of papers signed under duress. One of the most immediate consequences was the forced opening of ports. Where once Guangzhou had been the primary centre of foreign trade, the treaties now required multiple coastal cities to admit foreign merchants. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and others were open to ships from across the seas. With them came warehouses, banks, and foreign enclaves. The Qing dynasty, which had once carefully controlled foreign influence, now had no choice but to accept it. Among the goods that flowed through these ports was opium, now effectively legalized. The drug that Lin Zexu had tried to destroy was given legitimacy by treaty, its trade protected not only by smugglers, but by the authority of international law. Pipes that had once been lit in secrecy could now be lit openly, with no fear of punishment. The empire was also forced to pay enormous sums in war indemnities. Silver that was already scarce drained further from the treasury. The cost of the conflict did not fall only on officials. It trickled down to farmers, merchants, and ordinary families through higher taxes and new levies. People who had already suffered from poverty and addiction now bore the burden of financing their own humiliation. The state, desperate for funds, squeezed the population even harder, creating resentment and despair. The payments to foreign powers became a permanent reminder of weakness, each shipment of silver a symbol of lost sovereignty. Land, too, was surrendered. Hong Kong was ceded outright to Britain, a permanent mark of defeat carved into the map. Other regions were effectively taken over through foreign settlements and spheres of influence. The loss of territory was not only physical but also symbolic. An empire that had always seen itself as the centre of the world now found pieces of itself carved away. Boundaries that had once been unquestioned were now subject to negotiation with outsiders. Perhaps most damaging was the loss of legal authority. In the new treaty ports, foreigners were not subject to Chinese law. Instead, they were tried in their own courts, governed by their own consuls, and shielded from local justice. This system of extraterritoriality created small pockets of foreign control within Chinese cities. It was as if the empire's sovereignty had been hollowed out from within. The sight of foreigners walking the streets immune to local laws was a daily reminder that the dynasty no longer ruled its own land fully. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like having foreign governments set up offices in major cities where their citizens could break local laws without consequence. These changes combined to transform the identity of China itself. What had been a confident empire, proud of its traditions and its independence, became a nation hemmed in by treaties and dictated to by outsiders. The grandeur of the Forbidden City and the rituals of the court continued, but they rang hollow against the reality of foreign gunboats in Chinese rivers and foreign judges in Chinese courts. The psychological impact was immense. For the ruling elite, the treaties were humiliating, but for ordinary people, they were disorienting. The empire had always been presented as strong and divinely favoured. To see it yield so easily, to see it pay silver and surrender land, shook faith in its leaders. Communities that had endured hardship with loyalty now began to doubt. The mandate of heaven, once unquestioned, seemed fragile. The treaties also deepened dependency. With ports open, foreign goods flooded in, undermining local industries. Artisans who had once thrived found themselves competing with cheaper, mass-produced imports. Merchants who had once controlled trade within their regions found themselves sidelined by foreign companies. Economic sovereignty slipped away alongside political control. For the foreign powers, these treaties were victories that brought wealth and influence. For China, they were chains. Every clause represented another piece of independence lost. Each open port became another entry point for influence. Each indemnity payment drained more strength. The unequal treaties were not simply legal agreements, they were instruments of domination. The shift from empire to fragmented nation began here. China was no longer the sole master of its fate. Its decisions were shaped by documents drafted in foreign capitals, enforced by foreign navies, and defended by foreign troops. The dynasty, once the confident centre of the world, now looked outward with anxiety, knowing that it was being pulled apart. I cannot help but feel that the true damage of these treaties was not only in silver or land, but in the sense of dignity that was stripped from an ancient civilization. The legacy of the unequal treaties was long and bitter. They set a pattern that would be repeated with each new defeat. More ports opened, more land surrendered, more authority lost. The people came to see their government not as protector, but as a body that signed away their future. Each treaty deepened resentment, not only against foreigners, but also against the dynasty itself. What began with the destruction of opium at Human and the cannons of British ships ended with signatures that bound the empire in submission. The humiliation of those documents marked a turning point, when China ceased to act as a confident empire and became instead a state forced to yield. The path from sovereignty to subjugation was written in ink as much as in blood. The humiliation of the First Opium War might have been survivable if the Qing dynasty had used the defeat as a warning, but instead, the empire sank deeper into weakness. The unequal treaties that followed had opened ports, drained silver, and surrendered land. Yet opium continued to flow. By the 1850s, foreign merchants demanded even greater access, and when the Qing resisted, Britain and France returned with force. The Second Opium War revealed just how far the empire had collapsed. This was no longer a conflict over a single port or a few chests of opium. It was a full assault on the very heart of China's sovereignty. It is almost absurd that an empire once proud of its grandeur could be forced into submission twice within a single generation. Each time under the pretense of protecting a drug, the foreign powers pressed their advantage with precision. Britain and France, armed with modern weapons and industrial resources, pushed their demands beyond trade. They sought not only the legalization of opium but also broader rights for merchants, missionaries and diplomats. When negotiations stalled, they turned to violence. Their fleets sailed deep into Chinese waters, their troops advanced inland, and the dynasty's defences crumbled. The war was not marked by heroic battles, but by a steady series of humiliations, each one exposing the weakness of the Qing military and leadership. The most symbolic blow came in 1860, when Anglo-French forces marched into Beijing. The Qing court, unprepared and disorganized, could not stop them. The invaders entered the capital and headed for one of its most treasured sites, the Summer Palace, once a symbol of imperial elegance, filled with gardens, artworks, and treasures collected over centuries. It was looted and burned. The flames consumed not just buildings, but also the image of imperial dignity. Foreign soldiers walked through halls that emperors had considered untouchable, carrying away relics and jewels as trophies. To the world, the burning of the Summer Palace was a spectacle of power. To the Chinese, it was a wound that symbolized their empire's helplessness. The treaties that followed were even harsher than those signed after the First War. Known as the Treaties of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking, They forced the Qing to open more ports, pay greater indemnities, and accept foreign embassies in Beijing itself. The very idea that foreign envoys could reside in the capital, within reach of the emperor, was unthinkable in earlier centuries. Now it was law, land was ceded, silver drained, and sovereignty diminished further. Most shocking of all, opium was legalized. What Lin Zexu had once destroyed at Human, what had once been declared poison to the nation, was now protected by treaty. The armies that had burned the Summer Palace now guaranteed the right of merchants to sell the very substance that had crippled China. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like a country losing a war and then being forced to legalize the very narcotics that had destroyed its population, while foreign soldiers stood by to make sure the trade continued. For the Qing dynasty, the defeat was more than territorial or financial. It was psychological. The court could no longer pretend that it had control over its destiny. Each defeat deepened the impression that the empire was no longer master of its own fate. Foreign troops had walked through its capital, burned its treasures, and dictated its laws. The emperor himself had fled the city, leaving behind a symbol of weakness that could not be erased. The people, already suffering under addiction, poverty, and corruption, now faced even greater despair. The legalization of opium meant that the poison would flow with even greater ease. No longer confined to smuggling routes or shadowy dens, it was now a legitimate trade backed by international law and protected by foreign power. Families that had hoped for relief after Lin Zexu's stand at Human saw the opposite. Not only had the drug survived, it had triumphed. The military failures of the Second World War also exposed the futility of relying on outdated traditions. Banners and rituals could not stand against modern artillery. Courage alone could not defeat rifles and cannons. The Qing generals, many of whom had been weakened by addiction themselves, could not command effectively. Soldiers deserted, units collapsed, and fortresses surrendered with little resistance. The empire had been left defenseless by decades of decline, and the war simply made the weakness undeniable. The foreign powers celebrated their victory as a triumph of civilization and free trade. But for China, it was the confirmation of subjugation. The empire that had once viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, superior to all others, was now forced to kneel. The humiliation was recorded not only in the texts of treaties, but in the memories of a burned palace, the presence of foreign troops, and the legalized flow of opium. The legalization of the drug ensured that the cycle of decline would continue. Addiction deepened, silver drained faster, and social collapse spread wider. The very presence of foreign protection for the trade meant that the Qing dynasty could not even attempt meaningful resistance. Every pipe smoked in a village, every coin spent on imported opium, was now guaranteed by the threat of foreign guns. I cannot help but think that this stage of history shows how defeat is not only measured in lost battles, but in the way an entire society is forced to live under rules designed to weaken it further. The Second Opium War marked the point when decline became collapse. After this, the dynasty was not merely weakened, it was bound. Its sovereignty was shredded, its pride humiliated, and its people enslaved to a trade that it had once tried to resist. The burning of the Summer Palace was not just the loss of buildings, it was the destruction of illusions. The treaties that followed were not just agreements, they were chains. From this moment on, the Qing dynasty was no longer an empire in control of its destiny. It was a state surviving under foreign terms, its every weakness exploited and its every attempt at resistance crushed. The road ahead would only bring more defeats, more humiliations, and more evidence that the empire was collapsing under the weight of both internal decay and external domination. The accession of Hong Kong after the First Opium War seemed at first like the loss of a distant island, a wound painful in symbolism but perhaps not decisive in practice. Yet over time, it became clear that this single concession was one of the most significant blows to the Qing dynasty. What had once been a quiet fishing settlement was transformed by the British into a hub of commerce, a free port designed to channel the flow of trade across Asia. At its centre was opium. The very substance that had drained China of silver and strength was now given a permanent home just off its coast, under foreign control and beyond imperial law. It is almost laughable that an empire allowed the heart of its own destruction to sit proudly in a harbour flying another nation's flag. The transformation of Hong Kong was rapid. British engineers and merchants built docks, warehouses, and administrative offices. Ships arrived not only from India, where opium was cultivated, but from across the globe. The island became a staging ground where opium could be stored, managed, and shipped into China with efficiency. Smuggling was no longer a shadowy operation carried out at night along hidden coves. It was a structured business, supported by banks, merchants, and officials. For the British, the creation of Hong Kong was a triumph of strategy. For the Qing dynasty, it was a nightmare anchored just off its shores. The legal framework of the treaties ensured that the trade was protected. Chinese officials had no authority over the island, no power to regulate its commerce, and no means to challenge its growth. Every shipment of opium that entered China could now be traced back to warehouses in Hong Kong, where it was counted, priced, and dispatched under the watchful eye of foreign merchants. The idea of banning opium within the empire became meaningless when the supply chain was so secure, so close, and so well defended by foreign law and foreign guns. The openness of the trade in Hong Kong also gave it a veneer of respectability. Where smuggling had once carried a sense of danger, the new system presented opium as a legitimate product. Merchants openly discussed prices, contracts were signed, and profits were recorded. Newspapers reported on the business as if it were no different from tea or silk. The normalization of the trade in such a visible and official setting erased what little stigma remained. Pipes were no longer symbols of shame. They were simply part of a global business in which China was the captive market. The impact on Britain's financial system was immense. Silver that drained from China flowed into British banks. The profits from opium sales funded new ventures, expanded trade routes, and strengthened Britain's global dominance. The balance of wealth between the two nations shifted dramatically. What had once been a trade deficit for Britain, when it paid silver for Chinese tea, became a surplus funded by Chinese addiction. Britain grew stronger with every chest of opium shipped through Hong Kong, while China grew weaker with every coin spent on it. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like one nation building a global financial empire by selling addictive substances, while its rival watched its currency collapse. For China, the consequences were devastating. The presence of Hong Kong as a secure base meant that efforts to restrict opium were doomed before they began. Any attempt to stop the trade along the coast was circumvented by shipments from the island. Local officials, already compromised by bribes and addiction, had no chance of controlling such a well-organised system. The empire's sovereignty was mocked daily by the sight of ships sailing freely between Hong Kong and Chinese ports, carrying the very substance that had been declared poison but was now unstoppable. The symbolic weight of the island was also heavy. Each time a Chinese family watched a relative waste away from addiction, the chain of responsibility could be traced back to a foreign-controlled harbour operating in plain sight. Each time silver disappeared from circulation, its destination was the banks of Britain, enriched by the business of Hong Kong. Each time the government issued edicts against opium, the futility of those words was made clear by the thriving trade across the water. The island stood as a constant reminder of defeat and humiliation, visible proof that the empire could no longer control its own fate. The rise of Hong Kong as an opium hub also reshaped regional commerce. Chinese merchants who wanted to profit joined the system, working alongside foreigners to distribute the drug. Local networks connected with international ones, creating a trade web that stretched from Indian fields to Chinese villages. In this network, the Qing government had no role except as a powerless observer. The empire that had once demanded tribute from others was now reduced to watching foreign merchants dictate terms on its doorstep. The cultural consequences were equally corrosive. Hong Kong became not just a trading post, but a symbol of modernity and global connection. Some Chinese elites, eager to appear sophisticated, pointed to the island as proof of progress. Yet beneath the surface, the reality was decay. The progress they admired was built on a trade that hollowed out their society, drained their treasury, and weakened their people. To admire Hong Kong was to admire the machinery of its own decline. I cannot help but think that seeing ships loaded with poison sail legally from a foreign-controlled harbour into their own nation must have been one of the bitterest humiliations for the Qing dynasty. By the time the full significance of Hong Kong was understood, it was too late. The island had become entrenched as a hub of global trade, with legal protections and military backing that no Qing decree could challenge. Its docks bustled with activity, its warehouses filled with goods, and its banks grew rich from profits. For the dynasty, each chest of opium that passed through Hong Kong was another step into weakness, another reminder that sovereignty had been lost not only in distant treaties but in daily life. The cession of Hong Kong was not just the loss of land, it was the creation of a permanent wound, one that bled wealth, dignity, and strength. The empire had handed its enemy the perfect tool to continue its destruction, and the enemy had used it with ruthless efficiency. What began as a small island became a symbol of how far China had fallen and how completely its fate was now tied to forces beyond its control. The suffering of the common people deepened as the years of opium spread across the empire. For the poor, who had little to begin with, the drug was both a false comfort and a final destruction. Families who could not afford proper medicine turned to opium when illness struck. A few drops seemed to ease pain, quiet coughs, or calm fevers, but over time it hollowed out their bodies and their spirits. Without access to real cures, many clung to the pipe as their only relief. What began as a desperate choice became a chain that bound them. For countless poor men and women, opium became not only a substance they consumed, but the symbol of their hopelessness. It is almost grotesque to think that in a land once celebrated for its herbal knowledge and medical traditions, people were reduced to spending their last coins on imported poison. As addiction spread among the poor, the countryside began to show signs of collapse. Villages that had once been filled with the rhythm of farming seasons grew silent. Rice paddies lay untended, fields were left fallow, and tools rusted where they were dropped. Men who should have been bent over crops now lay motionless in the smoke. Women who should have been preserving food or weaving cloth were left alone to manage households too large for their strength. The cycle of agriculture, which had sustained China for millennia, was broken not by famine or flood, but by the weakness of its own people. Hunger followed. Without crops, families starved, and without labour, communities withered. The empire that had once prided itself on feeding the largest population in the world was now failing to keep even its villages alive. The visible decay of rural life was shocking. Houses fell into disrepair, granaries stood empty, and livestock disappeared. Some families sold animals to buy opium, trading their only means of survival for fleeting moments of relief. Others sold land or borrowed heavily, sinking into debts they could never repay. Generations of work were squandered in a few years of addiction. Villages once known for their festivals and harvest celebrations became places of despair. The few who resisted the habit often could not support entire communities that had already succumbed. The loss of food and labour led to famine in some regions. Starvation was no longer a distant threat, but a daily reality. Parents watched children grow thin, unable to provide enough rice or grain to sustain them. Some families abandoned infants, unable to care for them. Others left villages entirely, wandering in search of work or food, only to find the same conditions elsewhere. The countryside, once the strong base of the empire, became a wasteland of smoke, hunger, and despair. If we looked at it in modern terms, it would be like an entire farming region abandoning food production because every household had chosen addiction over survival. In towns and cities, the collapse of the countryside was felt in rising prices and empty markets. Grain became scarce, goods became more expensive, and the poor became more desperate. With no work and no food, many turned to crime. Theft rose sharply, not as calculated robbery, but as desperate acts to survive or to pay for more opium. People stole from neighbours, markets, and even family members. The fabric of trust that had bound communities together unravelled. Villages that had once been safe places where doors were left open at night became places of suspicion and fear. Violence followed. Bandit groups formed, some fueled by desperation, others by opportunity. They roamed the countryside, raiding farms and small towns. The government, already weakened, had little ability to stop them. In many cases, soldiers were too compromised by addiction to fight effectively, or they joined in the disorder themselves. Local militias sometimes resisted, but they too were weakened by the same problems. Lawlessness spread like the smoke that had caused it, leaving no part of society untouched. Riots broke out in towns where hunger and poverty were greatest. Crowds gathered to demand relief from officials, but those same officials were often corrupt, addicted, or powerless. Confrontations turned violent, shops were looted, tax offices burned, and government representatives attacked. The empire that had once prided itself on harmony and stability now faced constant outbreaks of unrest. Each riot was another sign that the bond between people and state had been broken. The desperation of the people was also visible in migration. Families abandoned ancestral homes, hoping to find better lives elsewhere. But instead of opportunity, they often found more poverty and more opium. The spread of addiction was so complete that there were few safe havens left. Those who fled famine or debt often ended up in the same misery, only in a different place. The vastness of the empire, once a source of resilience, became a trap as the same problems repeated everywhere. For women and children, the suffering was particularly severe. Women were left widowed not by death in war, but by the slow death of addiction. They took on the roles of farmers, labourers, and protectors, often without the strength to succeed. Many were sold or abandoned, treated as commodities in households desperate for money. Children were forced into work, into crime, or into early addiction themselves. The very future of the empire, carried in its young, was poisoned before it could grow. I cannot help but think that watching villages full of hungry children while their fathers lay beside empty pipes must have been one of the most heartbreaking sights of the era. The collapse of daily life for ordinary people revealed the full scope of the crisis. It was not only a matter of silver or sovereignty, of armies or officials, it was the unravelling of survival itself. The people who had once tilled the soil, filled the markets, and kept the empire alive were no longer able to do so. Their strength was gone, their hope was gone, and their loyalty to the state was fading. By the time the dynasty began to recognise the scale of the catastrophe, it was too late. The damage was already embedded in families, villages, and entire provinces. The people were no longer the sturdy base of the empire, but its weakest point. An empire without strong people cannot endure. In the smoke-filled villages and starving households of Qing China, the truth of that lesson was written plainly. The suffering of the people did not remain silent forever. Hunger, poverty, and addiction had hollowed out families and villages, but resentment grew alongside despair. By the middle of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty faced not only foreign invasions but also uprisings born within its own borders. The most devastating of these was the Taiping Rebellion, a movement fueled by anger at the dynasty's weakness and by promises of a different future. It was not simply a protest against rulers. It was a civil war that spread across provinces, drawing in millions and leaving destruction on a scale that rivaled the very wars fought with foreign powers. It is almost absurd to think that while the empire struggled against British and French cannons, its greatest threat came from starving farmers and disillusioned peasants who had nothing left to lose. The rebellion grew out of despair. Families ruined by opium, fields abandoned, and taxes raised beyond endurance created the perfect soil for revolt. Leaders of the Taiping promised justice, equality, and the cleansing of corruption. For villagers who had watched officials indulge in smoke while demanding taxes, the promises rang true. They joined by the thousands, bringing with them their desperation, their anger, and their hope that something new might save them. What began as a small religious and social movement became an army that marched across provinces, capturing towns and cities, and challenging the authority of the dynasty itself. For the Qing court, the timing could not have been worse. Foreign powers were pressing from the coasts, demanding new treaties and greater control. At the same time, rebellion spread through the heartland, cutting off revenues, disrupting supply lines, and exposing the weakness of the army. The dynasty found itself fighting two wars at once, one against external invaders with superior weapons, and one against its own people who no longer trusted it. The strain was unbearable. The Qing military, already weakened by addiction and corruption, was unable to face both challenges. Soldiers deserted, garrisons collapsed, and commanders floundered. In many cases, local communities had to defend themselves, raising militias because the imperial army could not. Some of these militias fought the rebels, while others joined them. Authority fragmented, and the idea of a unified empire slipped further away. The image of imperial banners carried proudly across the land was replaced by scenes of local warlords, rebel leaders, and fragmented armies battling for control. The destruction caused by the Taiping Rebellion was immense. Crops were burned, cities sacked, and populations displaced. Families that had already suffered from famine and addiction now endured violence as well. Refugees filled the countryside, carrying stories of burned homes and lost relatives. Disease spread in the wake of armies, and the death toll rose into the millions. The rebellion was not simply a political challenge to the dynasty. It was a human catastrophe that deepened the collapse of society. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like a nation already struggling under economic collapse, being torn further apart by a massive civil war, while foreign armies stood on its borders demanding concessions. The court in Beijing was paralyzed. Emperors and advisors argued over how to respond, but their decisions were slow, inconsistent, and often undermined by corruption. Some officials sought to negotiate, others to crush the rebellion with force, but few had the resources or the discipline to succeed. Silver was drained by indemnities to foreign powers, armies were drained by addiction, and the bureaucracy was drained by incompetence. The dynasty had nothing solid left to use against such a massive uprising. Foreign powers watched carefully. Some chose to intervene, not to support the Qing dynasty out of loyalty, but to protect their own interests. Missionaries, merchants, and soldiers maneuvered through the chaos, taking advantage of weakened authority. The rebellion revealed to outsiders just how fragile the empire had become. Even when foreign soldiers cooperated with Qing forces, it was clear that the dynasty was not in control. It was surviving only because others allowed it. For ordinary people, the rebellion brought devastation upon devastation. Villagers already exhausted by addiction and hunger were conscripted into armies, forced to fight for causes they barely understood. Towns became battlegrounds, homes turned into fortresses, and families were scattered. The suffering of daily life under addiction was replaced by the suffering of war with no relief in sight. The inability of the Qing dynasty to manage both external and internal crises at once was the clearest sign of its decline. An empire that cannot protect its people from invasion or rebellion cannot maintain loyalty. Trust in the dynasty evaporated, replaced by either allegiance to local leaders or resignation to chaos. The people no longer looked to Beijing for stability. They looked only to survival. The Taiping Rebellion showed that the crisis of opium was more than personal or economic. It had hollowed out the empire to the point where a massive uprising could flourish. Without addiction, without corruption, Perhaps the dynasty could have faced the challenge with strength. Instead, it staggered, torn between foreign powers and domestic fury, unable to manage either. The flames of rebellion burned alongside the smoke of opium, each feeding the other. The empire, already weakened, was pushed to the edge of collapse. Its people no longer believed in its strength, its soldiers no longer had the will to fight, and its leaders no longer had the clarity to act. I cannot help but think that the true tragedy of this period is how the dynasty lost not only battles, but the faith of its own people, leaving rebellion to rise from the very soil it had once nourished. The Qing dynasty faced foreign ships at its coasts and rebel armies in its heartland, and with both pressing hard, it found itself staggering toward a future it could no longer control. The erosion of Qing authority did not stop with foreign invasions or internal rebellions. As the dynasty grew weaker, its grip on the provinces loosened. The central government in Beijing, already drained of silver and unable to control its armies, found that its commands no longer carried weight across the empire. Governors, generals, and local leaders who were once loyal to the throne began to act independently. They raised their own forces, collected their own taxes, and made decisions without waiting for imperial approval. In some cases, they openly defied the court. In others, they simply ignored it. The result was the slow but steady fragmentation of China into regions that acted like small, separate states. It is almost ridiculous that an empire which once demanded tribute from distant lands could no longer command obedience from its own provinces. The weakness of the central government created opportunities for ambitious men. Local military leaders, often former generals or warlords in all but name, gathered power by controlling both soldiers and supplies. Many of these men financed their armies not through loyalty to the state, but through the opium trade. They taxed shipments, ran smuggling routes, or even controlled the dens where it was sold. The very substance that had crippled the empire became their source of strength. With opium money, they could buy weapons, pay soldiers, and maintain authority in their regions. The irony was plain while the empire collapsed under the weight of addiction. Local strongmen grew rich and powerful by exploiting it. The provinces became more like small kingdoms than loyal territories. Each had its own rules, its own armies, and its own priorities. Some focused on trade, others on agriculture, others on military power. Few gave much thought to the commands of Beijing. The emperor, once regarded as the son of heaven whose authority extended across all of China, now ruled only in name. In practice, his power ended at the walls of the Forbidden City. Beyond them, real authority belonged to those who had soldiers and money, and both often came from opium. For ordinary people, the fragmentation was devastating. Taxes varied wildly from one region to another. In some places, peasants were forced to pay not only official taxes but also levies demanded by local warlords. In others, they were pressed into service as soldiers, their lives consumed in endless conflicts between rival leaders. The dream of stability under a strong empire, promised for centuries, was replaced by the daily reality of living in a fractured land. Families who had once thought of themselves as subjects of a vast and unified state now lived under the control of whichever warlord held power in their region. The courts and schools that had once represented the presence of the central state also declined. Local leaders sometimes maintained them, but only to serve their own purposes. Education that had once been directed toward preparing men for imperial examinations lost its meaning when the central government no longer commanded authority. The law that had once flowed from the capital became inconsistent, replaced by arbitrary decrees from local strongmen. The very identity of being part of a single Chinese empire began to blur. Foreign powers exploited the fragmentation with ease. They negotiated directly with regional leaders, offering trade deals, protection, or weapons in exchange for influence. The unequal treaties had already carved the empire into zones of foreign privilege. Now the weakness of the centre made those divisions even sharper. Britain, France, and later other powers could deal with provinces as if they were independent states. The authority of the central government meant little in the face of foreign ships anchored at regional ports. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like watching a once unified country split into dozens of mini-states, each run by its own governor who cared more about foreign profits than about the unity of the nation. The reliance on opium revenue made the situation even worse. Local leaders who might have sought to strengthen their regions in other ways instead depended on the easy money of the drug trade. Farmers were encouraged to grow opium poppies rather than food. Traders were pushed to expand distribution networks. Soldiers were paid with silver that came from the misery of addicts. This dependence meant that any attempt to rebuild the nation's strength was undermined from the start. The empire was not only divided but also addicted at its very core. The emperor and his advisors issued edicts condemning the rise of regional powers, but these declarations had little effect. Without loyal armies or sufficient silver, they could not enforce their will. Each failed attempt to reassert control only highlighted the dynasty's weakness. Local leaders, seeing the impotence of the throne, grew bolder. The structure of centralized power, once the defining feature of Chinese governance, was now little more than a hollow shell. For the population, the constant division meant insecurity. Trade routes were unsafe, villages were raided, and taxes were unpredictable. People who had once identified with a great empire now thought of themselves as subjects of whichever warlord ruled nearby. The sense of belonging to a unified whole, which had bound China together for centuries, was lost. The moral authority of the dynasty had already collapsed under opium, and now its political authority followed. I cannot help but think that this fragmentation was one of the most painful stages of decline, because it showed not only weakness, but also disunity, the loss of the very idea of a shared destiny. An empire that had once seen itself as eternal was now breaking apart into pieces, each piece ruled by men who profited from the poison that had destroyed the whole. By the time the dynasty tried to reassert control, the fragmentation was too deep. Local armies were stronger than imperial ones, local treasuries richer than the central one, and local loyalties firmer than loyalty to the throne. The Qing dynasty was no longer the master of China. It was merely another player among many, one more faction in a land that had ceased to believe in unity. The weakness of the Qing dynasty invited not only rebellion from within but domination from without. Foreign powers that had once begged for the right to trade in limited ports now established entire zones of control inside China. These concessions, known as treaty ports and foreign settlements, were carved directly into Chinese cities. Within their walls, Chinese law had no power, and the presence of the Qing state was reduced to shadows. Foreign governments set up their own courts, police, and administrations. Streets once ruled by Chinese magistrates now displayed foreign flags, and neighborhoods were patrolled by foreign soldiers. It is almost absurd that the empire, which had once demanded tribute from surrounding kingdoms, now tolerated islands of foreign sovereignty planted in the middle of its own land. These foreign enclaves were more than trading posts. They were miniature colonies, run by officials who answered not to Beijing but to London, Paris, or Tokyo. Buildings rose in European style, streets were laid out according to foreign plans, and Chinese citizens found themselves treated as outsiders in their own cities. Within these enclaves, foreign merchants conducted business free from Chinese oversight. Banks handled silver and opium transactions, shipping companies organized exports, and consuls enforced laws written thousands of miles away. The image was clear: the Qing dynasty was no longer in control of its own territory. The principle of extraterritoriality deepened the humiliation. Foreigners accused of crimes in China were not tried by Chinese courts. Instead, they were judged by their own officials, often acquitted or given light punishments. Chinese victims had no recourse, and Chinese officials had no power to intervene. A foreign merchant could insult, cheat, or even injure a local citizen, and the law of the empire would remain silent. This legal inequality was visible every day in ports and settlements, a constant reminder that sovereignty had been compromised. The concessions also became centres of the opium trade, protected by foreign law and foreign soldiers. Warehouses stocked with chests of the drug operated openly. Ships carried it in and out without fear of confiscation. Chinese officials who attempted to interfere were blocked by foreign authorities. The trade that had once been illegal and shameful was now carried out in broad daylight, under the protection of international agreements. Addiction spread further, and the profits flowed not into Chinese coffers, but into foreign banks. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like a nation allowing entire districts of its capital to be governed by other countries, where local citizens had no rights and the most destructive industries were not only tolerated but celebrated. The presence of these foreign-controlled areas reshaped Chinese cities. Shanghai, Tianjin, and other ports became divided places. On one side of a street, Chinese homes and businesses struggled under poverty and addiction. On the other side, foreigners enjoyed paved roads, streetlights, and modern conveniences funded by profits from trade. The contrast was humiliating. Ordinary people could see the wealth generated from their own misery displayed in buildings they could not enter and laws they could not challenge. This situation also created resentment. Many Chinese saw their leaders as powerless or complicit. The emperor remained distant in Beijing while foreign powers built courts and barracks in the very heart of the empire. The dynasties claimed to be the son of heaven, ruling all under the sky, rang hollow when streets in its own cities were governed by outsiders. Confidence in the dynasty eroded further, as people no longer saw it as capable of protecting even the basic dignity of sovereignty. Foreign missionaries and merchants added to the sense of intrusion. Churches, schools, and trading houses were established in the treaty ports, often accompanied by foreign guards. While some provided educational relief, many were resented as symbols of cultural invasion. Conflicts flared between locals and foreigners, but Chinese authorities were powerless to intervene. Each confrontation reinforced the sense that China was no longer in charge of its destiny. The cumulative effect was the transformation of China into what observers called a semi-colony. Unlike India, conquered outright by Britain, or smaller nations seized by force, China remained formally independent. The emperor still sat on his throne, edicts were still issued and rituals still performed, but the reality was hollow. The essential powers of sovereignty, control over trade, territory, law, and finance were in foreign hands. China had been reduced to the form of an empire without its substance. For the Chinese people, daily life was filled with reminders of this status. Walking through a port city meant passing from one world to another, from Chinese streets filled with poverty to foreign streets filled with wealth. Paying taxes meant funding a state that no longer protected them. Seeing officials defer to foreign consuls meant watching the humiliation of their own government. The sense of pride that had once come from belonging to a great empire was replaced by shame and resentment. I cannot help but think that this half-colonial status must have been in some ways worse than outright conquest, because it left the symbols of sovereignty intact while stripping away all of its reality. The system of foreign control spread with each new treaty and each new defeat. More ports opened, more settlements established, and more rights granted to outsiders. The dynasty could not resist. Every attempt at negotiation ended with more concessions, and every sign of weakness encouraged further demands. The foreign powers had discovered that they did not need to conquer China fully to control it. They could rule from within, through enclaves, treaties, and the steady drain of resources. The fragmentation of sovereignty turned China into a nation divided not only by warlords and rebels, but also by foreign flags planted across its cities. Each enclave was a reminder of failure, each treaty a record of surrender, each concession a wound. The dynasty, already struggling with internal collapse, now had to endure the humiliation of foreign powers dictating the rules of daily life inside its own borders. The presence of these foreign-controlled zones was not temporary. They became entrenched, growing more powerful with time. their wealth increased, their influence deepened, and their authority expanded. China's identity as an empire was steadily eroded, replaced by the reality of a semi-colonial state surviving under the shadow of stronger nations. The long years of decline left China humiliated, impoverished, and divided. Yet from the very depths of that suffering, a new awareness began to grow. For ordinary people, the daily misery of addiction was no longer only a private tragedy, but a national wound. Families saw their fathers lost to smoke, their mothers sold into desperation, and their children starving in villages where crops lay abandoned. Slowly, the realization spread that opium was not simply a personal weakness, but a weapon wielded against the entire nation. It was the knife that cut through the empire's strength, leaving it open to foreign domination. It is almost ironic that the very substance once praised as medicine and elegance became recognized as the clearest symbol of national enslavement. This shift in perception did not come quickly. For decades, addiction had been accepted as normal, a part of daily life. Pipes were passed at banquets, dens filled with patrons, and even scholars and officials indulged openly. But as the empire collapsed under the weight of unequal treaties, military defeats, and foreign control, people began to see the connection. The humiliation of paying silver to foreigners, the loss of ports, and the presence of foreign enclaves were all tied to opium. What had once seemed like a private habit now appeared as the root of collective disaster. The recognition that opium was destroying not only families but the nation itself became a rallying cry. Out of this awakening came the first stirrings of resistance. Local communities began organizing campaigns to rid themselves of opium. Village leaders who once ignored the habit started preaching against it. Some groups smashed pipes, others boycotted opium dens, and still others worked to encourage farming over poppy cultivation. These actions were small and scattered, often suppressed by local authorities or ignored by officials. Yet they carried symbolic weight. They showed that people were no longer passive victims. They were beginning to fight back. For early revolutionaries, the fight against opium became inseparable from the fight against the Qing dynasty. They argued that a government unable to protect its people from poison, and in many cases complicit in spreading it, had lost the right to rule. Pamphlets and speeches denounced the dynasty for weakness, corruption, and betrayal. To rally people, reformers and revolutionaries pointed to the smoke-filled rooms and starving villages as proof that the empire had failed. The campaign against opium was thus also a campaign for national renewal. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like activists uniting a country against both drug cartels and a corrupt government that profited from them, seeing the two as part of the same enemy. The recognition of opium as a national threat also shaped the identity of Chinese nationalism. Unlike military defeats or territorial losses, which could be blamed on foreign powers, opium revealed how internal weakness made foreign domination possible. It showed that without moral and physical strength, no army or treaty could protect the nation. This realization inspired calls not only to resist foreigners, but also to reform society itself. A strong nation requires sober citizens, disciplined families, and leaders free of corruption. The campaign against opium became both practical and symbolic, a demand for health and a demand for dignity. Students and intellectuals played a major role in spreading this message. In schools and academies, they debated the causes of decline and concluded that addiction was central. Writers published essays describing villages ruined by smoke, poems lamenting the wasted lives of scholars, and tracts urging people to resist. The younger generation, less burdened by habits of indulgence, carried the banner of renewal. They saw themselves not only as heirs of a broken tradition, but as builders of a new future. Reformers also tied the campaign against opium to modernization. They argued that China could not build modern armies, industries, or schools while its people remained enslaved to smoke. They pointed to Western nations, not to admire them, but to show how discipline and productivity created power. For China to regain strength, It needed to rid itself of opium first. Factories, railways, and schools would be useless if workers, soldiers, and students were too weak to function. The war against opium was presented as the foundation of all other reforms. This awareness seeped into popular consciousness. Families that once accepted opium as unavoidable began to see it as shameful. Communities that had tolerated addiction began to ostracize it. The change was uneven, often resisted by those already trapped in the habit, but it marked a shift in values. No longer was the opium pipe a symbol of refinement or wealth. It became a mark of weakness and betrayal. To be addicted was not only a personal failing, but a sign of disloyalty to the nation. From this recognition, the seeds of revolution were planted. The fight against opium gave reformers and revolutionaries a cause that united people across classes. Farmers, merchants, students, and intellectuals could all see the damage it caused. Unlike abstract calls for constitutional reform or industrial development, the fight against opium was tangible, visible in every home and village. It gave nationalism a practical form, rooted in daily life. I cannot help but feel that this slow awakening was one of the few hopeful legacies of an otherwise devastating period, because it showed that even in despair, people could recognize the source of their chains and begin to resist. The Qing dynasty could not stop this shift. Its attempts to control the message were ineffective because the evidence was everywhere. Every starving family, every addicted official, every payment of silver to foreigners was proof that the dynasty had failed. The more the government tried to enforce its authority, the more people pointed to opium as the real ruler of China. National consciousness grew, not because the dynasty encouraged it, but because the people could see with their own eyes what was happening. By the late 19th century, this awareness had become widespread. Anti-opium campaigns were linked to broader reform movements, and the language of national survival became inseparable from the call to end addiction. Revolutionaries found in opium both a symbol and a weapon, a symbol of humiliation, and a weapon for rallying people to their cause. The empire that had once ruled with unquestioned authority now faced a population that identified its own survival with the dynasty's downfall. The irony of history is that out of devastation came the spark of resistance. The very substance that had been used to enslave the nation became the catalyst for awakening. As people realized that opium was the knife cutting into their future, they also realized that removing the dynasty that had failed to stop it was necessary. Out of smoke and suffering grew the idea of a nation that could stand on its own again. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty still sat on its throne, but the authority it claimed was little more than ceremony. The Forbidden City remained, the rituals continued, and edicts were issued in the emperor's name, yet the machinery of real power had slipped away. Provinces acted independently. Foreign powers controlled ports and concessions, and warlords commanded armies that no longer answered to Beijing. The dynasty existed as a symbol, but it no longer governed a functioning empire. It is almost absurd to imagine an emperor surrounded by grandeur who, in truth, had less control over his country than a foreign consul in a treaty port. The years after 1900 only deepened this reality. The Boxer Rebellion, meant as a final act of resistance against foreign domination, ended in further humiliation. Foreign armies marched into Beijing, imposed new indemnities, and occupied strategic positions. The Qing court survived, but only as a puppet tolerated by stronger powers. At home, famine, addiction, and corruption persisted. Abroad, the world moved rapidly forward with industrialization and modernization, leaving China behind. The empire, once confident as the Middle Kingdom, was now adrift. Its rulers unable to stop the decay spreading through every part of society. Opium remained central to this decline. For decades it had weakened armies, drained silver, and corrupted officials. By 1900 it had also hollowed out the very spirit of the people. Families broken by addiction could not rebuild. Villages lost to hunger, and poverty did not recover. Scholars and students dulled by smoke did not become leaders. Even as reformers called for modernization and self-strengthening, their efforts were sabotaged by a population chained to opium. The poison had worked slowly but thoroughly, eating away at the foundations of society until there was little left to hold together. The dynasty's attempts at reform in its final years were too little and too late. The so-called new policies introduced modern schools, railways, and military training, but they lacked the resources and authority to succeed. Foreign powers still dictated terms, and warlords still controlled regions. Worse still, addiction had left the empire without the human strength to carry out change. Soldiers could not be trained into modern armies when many of them remained weakened by years of smoke. Students could not become engineers and administrators when classrooms had been emptied by decades of neglect. The reforms looked impressive in writing, but in reality, they were hollow. The people, meanwhile, had lost faith in the dynasty. For centuries, they had endured hardship with loyalty, believing in the emperor as the son of heaven. But after defeats, treaties, and endless humiliation, that belief evaporated. Families who had sacrificed to feed armies or pay taxes now saw only failure. Communities that had once looked to Beijing for guidance now looked to local leaders, revolutionaries, or foreign examples. The dynasty no longer inspired loyalty, it inspired resentment and despair. The revolutionary movement drew strength from this disillusionment. Reformers, students, and intellectuals who had grown frustrated with the failures of the dynasty began to organize for change. They spoke openly of overthrowing the old order and building a new China. Anti-opium campaigns became part of their platform, symbols of national renewal. To rally people, they pointed to the smoke-filled dens, the drained treasuries, and the empty villages as proof that the Qing could not save the nation. The revolutionaries promised that only by sweeping away the dynasty could China hope to rise again. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like a government so corrupt and ineffective that citizens looked not to reform but to complete replacement, seeing no other path forward. The final blow came in 1911. The Xinhai Revolution, sparked in part by military uprisings and fueled by years of resentment, spread rapidly across provinces. Soldiers deserted the dynasty, provinces declared independence, and local leaders turned against Beijing. The emperor, a child at the time, was powerless. The court, filled with divided factions and addicted officials, had no means to resist. Within months, a dynasty that had ruled for centuries collapsed. The abdication of the last emperor in 1912 marked the end of imperial China and the beginning of a new but uncertain era. What is striking about the fall of the Qing is how little resistance it encountered in its final moments. There was no great last stand, no decisive battle to defend the throne. Instead, the dynasty faded quietly, its authority already eroded by decades of weakness. By the time the revolution came, the empire was a shell. The rituals continued, but the power had long since drained away. The people did not rise to defend it because they no longer believed it was worth defending. Opium was not the only cause of this collapse, but it was a central one. It had undermined the military, corrupted the bureaucracy, and drained the treasury. More importantly, it had destroyed the confidence of the people. An empire can survive defeat, poverty, or even rebellion if its people still believe in its legitimacy. But an empire cannot survive when its own citizens see it as complicit in their suffering. Opium made that suffering universal and undeniable. I cannot help but feel that the tragedy of the Qing dynasty was not simply its fall, but the way it allowed itself to be hollowed out from within, so that by the end it collapsed without dignity, without resistance, and without hope. The slow poison of opium, tolerated and even protected by its rulers, had achieved what no foreign army alone could: the dismantling of a civilization's core. The fall of the Qing dynasty marked the end of imperial rule in China, but it also stood as a warning. No matter how grand a throne, no matter how old a tradition, A state cannot survive when its people are broken, its leaders corrupt, and its foundations rotted by addiction. The abdication of 1912 was simply the final step in a decline that had been unfolding for generations, a decline fueled and hastened by the soft weapon of opium. The decline of the Qing dynasty was not sudden, but stretched across generations, each decade bringing another layer of weakness, until the empire no longer resembled the confident state it once had been. The most striking fact is that this collapse did not come from enemy armies at the gates, or from a famine beyond endurance, but from a substance willingly allowed to enter the homes of millions. Opium seeped into families, villages, and palaces, turning strength into weakness and discipline into indulgence. The dynasty that had once commanded respect from neighbours and demanded tribute from afar was undone not by steel or fire, but by smoke curling from countless pipes. It is almost laughable that centuries of defence against steppe invasions and naval threats were wasted when a drug, packed neatly into small wooden chests, did what armies never could. Opium worked slowly, but that was its strength. At first, it was praised as medicine, easing pain and calming nerves. Doctors prescribed it, merchants sold it, and households used it without fear. Yet what seemed like healing turned into chains. Families sold belongings to buy more, soldiers lost discipline, and officials abandoned their duties. The economy drained of silver, the army lost its fighting power, and the bureaucracy dissolved into corruption. The dynasty, weakened from within, was ripe for exploitation. Foreign merchants and governments recognized the opportunity. Britain, in particular, saw that selling opium would reverse its trade deficit and enrich its treasury. By cultivating the drug in India and shipping it into China, it created not just a market but a weapon. When resistance came, as in Lin Zexu's burning of opium at Human, the empire's weakness was exposed. Wars followed, and each defeat carved away sovereignty. Ports were forced open, silver drained faster, and opium itself was legalized by treaties that mocked the dynasty's authority. The social impact was equally corrosive. Families once guided by Confucian values collapsed. Fathers neglected children, wives were abandoned, and communities starved as fields were left untended. Teachers, scholars, and officials who had been pillars of society fell into addiction, leaving the people without guidance. A culture that had once celebrated discipline and harmony was replaced by art, songs, and literature steeped in indulgence. Even rituals and festivals became occasions for smoking rather than unity. The very soul of the nation was reshaped by smoke. Foreign control deepened the humiliation. Treaty ports became enclaves of foreign rule, where Chinese law had no power. Hong Kong turned into the hub of the global opium trade, protected by British guns and banks. In cities like Shanghai, Chinese citizens walked past foreign streets lit by lamps and paved with wealth, knowing those luxuries were funded by their own addiction. Sovereignty remained in name but disappeared in reality. The empire had become a semi-colony, bound by paper treaties more powerful than any army. If we think of it in modern terms, it would be like watching entire districts of a capital governed by outsiders, where destructive industries were not only tolerated but celebrated. The political structure is fractured. Warlords and local leaders, many of them funded by the drug trade, ruled provinces as personal kingdoms. The central government issued edicts that few obeyed. The emperor, still performing rituals in the Forbidden City, had less power than the consuls in treaty ports. The dynasty looked whole from a distance, but up close it was broken into pieces, and yet, from this misery, a realization slowly emerged. People began to see opium not just as a personal weakness, but as the symbol of national enslavement. Reformers and revolutionaries pointed to the smoke-filled dens as proof that the dynasty could no longer protect its people. Anti-opium campaigns became tied to calls for national renewal. To fight the drug was to fight for survival, and to fight for survival was to fight against the dynasty that had allowed it. I cannot help but think that this moment of awakening, though late, was the one hopeful spark in a time otherwise marked by despair. The final years of the dynasty were hollow. After 1900, foreign powers dictated terms openly, warlords controlled provinces, and the emperor was reduced to a ceremonial figure. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 swept away what remained. The abdication of the last emperor ended centuries of imperial rule, but the collapse had already been written in decades of smoke, silver, and shame. The greatest lesson of history is that empires do not always fall with great battles or sudden invasions. Sometimes they fall with quiet choices repeated millions of times, choices to indulge rather than resist, to escape rather than endure. Opium revealed that the loss of self-control is the first step to the loss of sovereignty. Without discipline, no army, treasury, or tradition can protect a state. The Qing dynasty, once the proud Middle Kingdom, fell not because its enemies were too strong, but because it became too weak. The white smoke that seemed harmless proved more destructive than any sword. Its cost was measured not only in silver and territory, but in the dignity and will of a people. Thank you for staying with this story. May its lessons linger quietly as you rest. A reminder that strength begins with self-control. Sleep well, and good night.